All right, hi everybody. So we have now six people in, and true to A&R's nature, I'm sure we'll have a few people trickle in slowly as we get started. Since we have a smaller group, wanted to begin by just having everybody go around, introduce themselves, and you can kind of say how much of 4-H history you feel that you know, if you're, a novice expert or just here to learn more. So, and of course, what your position is within A&R. So I'm going to go ahead and pick on Nicole because she's the first in my view. If you want to start with that introduction and what you know about the history of 4-H.
Hi folks, my name is Nicole Marshall Wheeler. I'm the 4-H advisor in Colusa, Sutter, and Yuba counties. Well, the most history of 4-H that I've learned is I've heard a very similar presentation before about the history of 4-H, and I'm interested to learn more and see what's been updated or what new information that has been uncovered, because the history of 4-H is like long and complicated and it has lots of layers. So I am interested in knowing more.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. And now we're getting more people, I guess maybe because of my reminder. But next, John, do you want to introduce yourself and explain the extent of your 4-H knowledge?
Hi, this is John Borba. I'm the 4-H advisor down in Kern County, and I've worked in 2 different states, and I'd like to say I know everything there is about it, but I don't. And I've got a book on my shelf that I've been meaning to read ever since I got hired called, I can't read the title, my eyes don't work as well as they used to, but it's a history of 4-H. And in the 20-some years, I still haven't read the book. So I think I know a bit, but not as much as I wish I did.
I'm curious to see, I might follow up with you and ask what you found, because there's not very many books that are a comprehensive history on 4-H. Brenda, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, John showing the book.
Oh yeah, An American Idea. Mm-hmm.
Hi everyone, I'm Brenda Vallis. I am the 4-H program rep for Contra Costa County. I like to think I'm more than a novice, but not quite intermediate, because I keep, even though I've been around 11 years, I keep finding new stuff every year. So there's definitely more out there to learn.
Cool. All right, and then let's see, Lori.
Let's see. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I've been in this position for 8.5 years. Before that, I grew up in the program myself. All 3 of my kids grew up in the program. My parents were leaders. My mom grew up in the program in Ohio. So I do have quite a bit of knowledge beyond California, but I wouldn't say I was expert. And when I was in 4-H, I did all the Chicago trips and national trips and all that type of stuff. So I've been around. I just wouldn't say I'm an expert.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And then let's see, we have Lauren Mckinney said she doesn't have a microphone. Actually, she said introduced herself as Sue. The program rep from Kern County said she's a novice with 4-H history. And then also Jessica Euler from Tehama County, who is their administrative secretary for 4-H, and said that she is new to 4-H as well. Rochelle, did you want to go ahead and share?
Sure, I will share. So yeah, I mean, I've never really did much studying up on it. I know the original origin history of 4-H because of being a high school ag teacher in California. So with, like how the development of the program and that sort of thing. But then other than that, and then what I've, what I'm aware of that went on in 4-H when I was in 4-H for a few years as a child, as well as from the last, 7 years in my staff position, but there's a whole lot of gaps in there. And, like I know we're a strong organization of always doing what we have done before because that's how we've done it, but not necessarily knowing the whys behind it. And so I think the biggest thing is the fact that, we've moved from an agricultural based youth development program to just overall youth development. And that's something that I think is not widespread and well known about our organization, which is why so many people don't know about 4-H, or they think that we can only work in a small little area of subject matter because of that history being agriculturally based. So it'd be interesting to find out kind of more details around like, when did we really convert, or, and obviously we haven't done the best job of that because however many years it's been since that began, we're still very much tied to it and stuck in that rut in some counties.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I do have a slide that talks about when 4-H really did begin making that change from an agriculturally based program to expanding beyond that. So I'm really excited that you brought that up.
Cool.
So we're getting a couple more people that have trickled in, and I don't want to exhaust all of our time with introductions. Anybody else have kind of a good history of 4-H factoids or trivia they want to share along with an introduction before I go ahead and begin?
So this is Suzanne. I'm with the state office doing marketing communications, and we do have a page on our website under About Us that is our 4-H history that was put up for the 100-year anniversary, but I'd like to update it with more current and more details because people find it interesting that, SLC kind of started as 4-H, or 4-H camps started on Davis campus and little more California focused.
Oh, okay.
Changes that will hopefully connect our youth to the history of why we're doing things the way we are. But I like the idea of adding more information about how we're transitioning to other types of programs.
Yeah, excellent. And I did go and look. That's one of the places I started with was the state website, and the history that we have on there is pretty true. It's honest. I think as a couple people pointed out, the history of 4-H it's just so complicated and multi-layered. But the one on there is pretty good. But I would be excited myself to learn more about the history within California 4-H because the focus of this is on our national program and the national history more. But with that, I will go ahead and get started. And a couple of disclaimers. So the beginning of this presentation actually started when I was a 4-Her. I gave a history of 4-H presentation and did my best to learn about all the history that was available at that time. And so recently, through Nicole Marshall Wheeler's recommendation, the Western Fairs Association asked if I would give this presentation to them. Nicole had remembered it from when we were kids. And so I began to go through and start updating it and realized a few things. One, I didn't cite my sources back in the day. That wasn't asked of us. And as I went through, I really quickly learned there is way more information available online now than there was 13 years ago when I started this, which has been tremendous. But it was also a little overwhelming to try to get this really up to snuff for where we should be today. And so the first half of the presentation, I've really edited and gone through. The second half, I'd like to do more of, but I think all of it will be informative for a lot of folks. And so I encourage anybody who, if you have a question Don't feel like you need to save it until the end. You can raise your hand or just speak up. And, we're all family here within 4-H. So if you've heard something different or know anything different, then please go ahead and throw it out there. And Nicole, could I rely on you actually to monitor the chat pod for me during the presentation?
I'll do my best. I have to jump off early, but I'll do my best.
Okay, Brenda, you're just the next one I see. Or are you going to be here probably?
Yep, I'll be here.
2:45. Okay, great. All right, so the beginning of 4-H. The simple answer is that it is not a simple answer, as we've discussed here a little bit. So no single person can be credited with founding 4-H, and there wasn't an exact time in which 4-H was founded. What you'll often see on different extension websites, even on the National 4-H website, is A.B. Graham, who was a teacher in Clark County, Ohio, in around the turn of the century. And he created a 4-H club, or a youth club, I should say, in 1902. And his club at the time, it didn't use the 4-H name or the 3-H name, as we'll talk about in a little bit, but focused instead on corn growing projects. And that belief in a practical education that extended beyond the classroom is one that seems to have grown really out of just a grassroots movement among educators across the Eastern United States. But as I pointed out in the advertising for this workshop or presentation, that was one of the myths, that it really started around the turn of the century. But in the readings that I've done, found that the earliest I could find was 1885, that there was actually an educator in one of the Great Lakes states who was offering swine growing projects for local boys, and then also offering contests with cash prizes and sponsorships from local businesses that were exhibited at, I think an exhibition would be a better name than a fair. But we saw a lot of that across, again, the Eastern United States in the turn of the century. And so Jessie Field Shamba was a woman who I was really excited to learn about this time around, giving this presentation. Hers was not a name that I heard when I started doing this around 2008. But she was herself also a school teacher in Iowa. And she began a 3-H club. And I can say with confidence that it was actually a 3-H club. She had 3 different H's, and I could not locate what all 3 of them meant, but I did find what one of them was. And just by show of hand or the little Zoom emoji, how many people here knew that the 4th H started out as hustle? That was one that a lot of people have heard. I know I did. And then I was shocked in doing the reading here that Jessie Field Shamba, one of her H's was actually home, which made perfect sense because a lot of these clubs, while they were not explicitly divided based on gender, inherently they were. So the boys did their swine growing or corn growing, and girls did home economics. They would do tomato canning or dressmaking or sewing. And so what you'll often hear are the first 4-H projects were corn growing and tomato canning. And I know it might sound like I'm not being very definitive here on anything, but that's really because it's hard to be. So, you had A.B. Graham, who certainly started a corn growing project, and you had Jessie Field Shamba, who offered tomato with some of her female members. But there were other educators across the Eastern United States who were doing slightly altered versions of these projects. So it's difficult to say anything is a definitive first or a definitive founder, for instance, in the history of 4-H. But another very interesting figure is Thomas M. Campbell. And he was actually the first African-American extension agent in 1914. And at first, I actually thought that that was quite progressive for USDA and cooperative extension to have a Black extension agent at the beginning of the cooperative extension program in 1914. But upon further reading, I found out that there were actually segregated land grant universities and extension programs. And so it made a little bit more sense. But Thomas M. Campbell, again, was doing these projects for youth, and then he also did them for families, not just the kids. And he has a really fascinating history. He was actually recommended to be an extension agent by the civil rights activist and academic Booker T. Washington, who at the time was the president of the Tuskegee Institute, where Thomas M. Campbell was a student. And so this, I think, this to me, it was just so iconic of a farm advisor. And back in the day, Thomas M. Campbell had an actual wagon that would be pulled around to different farms. They called it the Jessup wagon. And it was filled with seeds and different tools. And they would do actual lessons on the latest agricultural practices of the day. And he would share that with folks throughout Alabama and that multi-state area and the Delta. And I just found that incredibly fascinating. These photos certainly were not available, like I said, the first time around. But in these early days, when we had educators who were starting these youth clubs, they were not affiliated with the USDA, and they weren't affiliated with cooperative extension offices, especially for like the three that I show here, with the exception of Thomas and Campbell. The cooperative extension offices didn't even exist. These were just educators who wanted to give kids an opportunity to apply what they were learning beyond the classroom in a hands-on way. And then when the USDA did begin engaging with these farmers and attempting to teach them, they found that a lot of them were reluctant to follow the advice that the USDA had on the latest farming practices and scientific methods that were exploding at this time thanks to the Industrial Revolution. And so that's why I have on this slide is what came first, the club or the conspiracy? And does anybody know what conspiracy I might be talking about? Anybody? I'm sure somebody's heard it and they're just afraid to take a swing at it. But so the USDA, really what they wanted to do, since these farmers were not interested in listening to them, they said, okay, that's fine. Can we teach your kids? And the farmers, said, yeah, okay, go ahead, teach the kids, do whatever you want. And so on this next slide, we have, there we go. A boy by the name of, I need to reference my notes here, Marius Malmgren from Hickory, Virginia in 1912. And I don't know the full history here, but he was a member of a corn club that was using some of those newfound practices that were trickling down through the USDA to these educators that wanted to provide those extra opportunities. And he had an acre of corn that yielded 209 bushels. And at the time in the area, the adults that were farming were averaging about 45 bushels per acre. So it was pretty quick that these parents and adults started realizing that the USDA actually did have information that could be useful to them in a pragmatic way, and something that they might want to incorporate into their own farming. But this slide is perhaps the most important, and yeah, I just cannot underscore enough the Morrill and the Smith-Lever Acts. And many of you will probably be familiar with these. And if you're not, these are important acts of federal legislation to remember, because it really is why we have jobs today. And not only that, but it's an important part of US history because of how important agriculture is to the US economy today, and to Americana and the history that we have as US citizens, although there are some darker aspects to the history as well. And so the Morrill Act of 1862 established land that was designated, it was given from the federal government to each state, and it was specifically given for the purpose, and I'll read this, to create land grant colleges. And the purpose of those land grant colleges was, without excluding other scientific and classical studies, and including military tactic, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe, in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life. So anybody want to take a swing at translating that into modern English? Anybody? Jolynn, I saw that you joined. Why don't you go ahead and try and translate that for me, wherever you are. Okay, nope, we don't have Jolynn. So essentially what the Morrill Act was saying there.
I'm here. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Ask me again.
Hear the quote that I read?
No, I had just stepped out.
That's okay. It was basically the 1862 language of what the first Morrill Act did. And so I had already stated that it established land grant colleges in states by the federal government, granting each state land. The purpose was, like, without excluding scientific and classical studies or the military. The purpose of this is to teach agriculture and mechanic arts, to promote the liberal practical education of the industrial classes. So what is that all saying?
I mean, I think that it's to bring the education to the public is the idea, practical knowledge. Up until then, universities were private, and they were practicing and learning more, for lack of a better word, book smart type things.
Yes.
And so this was like the practical piece of it.
Yes, I would give you 100% on that answer. That's exactly it. So universities and colleges prior to the Morrill Act, they were private, they were for the affluent, and they were teaching the classics. So Latin, history, English, and perhaps some political science, but it was not what we would say today were the hard sciences. They were not teaching that. And so the Morrill Act specifically established universities in order to teach really members of the public who attended those universities, but beyond that, also act as universities do today and share that knowledge with the communities that are around them.
And I will say that part of history, and I don't know if you're going to talk about this, but part of 4-H history, we talk about, well, we're rooted in agriculture. But the one piece of the quote that you talked about was, the something of the day, the important things of the day. And that's really important, is that's why, yes, we are rooted in agriculture, but at the time, agriculture was was one of the biggest things that we were talking about and doing across the country at the time. So now as we move into STEM and all of those things, it's still within the kind of the understanding that we're doing the important work of the day.
Yeah, I don't know if this was the part of it, but it said in such a manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe. And that is an important facet of the Morrill Act, because it gave states themselves the authority to decide how those land grant universities were going to operate, what they were going to focus on, and what they were going to teach. However, this is one of the points where I do have to pause and say, so a lot of the land that the federal government did give to these states was native land that was taken by the federal government by force, whether passively or actively. And in 1862, a really neat fact is this probably never would have passed had the Civil War not been taking place. So a lot of the southern states were not interested in creating land grant universities. And so since the Morrill Act specifically said that states that were in an active state of secession from the Union would not benefit from this program, and those states were not sending representatives to Congress, it actually ended up passing both chambers, specifically because those southern states were not voting on it at the time. And then the 1890 Morrill Act extended what the first one did. And since this was following the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, said that historically, what we now call historically Black colleges and universities could also be deemed a land grant university. And if states were not going to integrate their schools, that it was acceptable for them to provide separate but equal funding for segregated schools. So that goes back to when I was talking about Thomason Campbell as being the first Black extension agent upon the passage of the Smith-Lever Act. It really wasn't that surprising, because in Alabama, the Tuskegee Institute was their cooperative extension land grant university for Black citizens in Alabama, because they were not allowed to be a part of Alabama's primary land grant university. So an important, but I think under discussed aspect of USDA cooperative extension 4-H history. But the Smith-Lever Act, which I have a typo here, apologies, of 1914 was incredibly important, because that's what actually established cooperative extension offices and for all of these states. And then, as many will know, in other states, people in our positions are called extension agents, and extension offices are a little bit better known, or I should say they're known by their actual name in other states. But this was just drastically important to the history of 4-H, the program, and extension offices at large, because it aided primarily in funding, but also in centralizing the organizations and so all of these clubs, we have Marius here, who's sitting on his corn in 1912. All of this, the movement towards the Smith-Lever Act was percolating in the ether at the time. And there was a desire to unify these groups across the Eastern United States, who educators were probably writing letters to each other and in education publications talking about having education founded upon principles where there were 3 H's or 4 H's or whatever it was. But it was not until 1914 that there was an official organization in the form of the Cooperative Extension Office that would then be able to actually lead these and act as a leadership body. And then, yes, and then I liked this. I remember keeping the final point here when I was a kid, because I grew hogs, but swine growing contests were the first livestock introduced to 4-H programs. And again, that goes back to, I think it was 1885 when that guy, and it was either Wisconsin or Michigan, was offering those contests with the kids in his school district. I want to take a pause here and ask if anybody has questions. We've covered quite a bit of ground and not a lot of time. And like I said, it hasn't been incredibly definitive.
Sounds great, Ryan. Keep going.
Okay. So the Clover and the pledge. As a lot of people will know, the 4-H clover originally started out as a 3-leaf clover with H's on each leaf, and they stood for head, heart, and hands. As I said, upon this second review of all of this information, I learned that there were some clubs who were operating with a 3-leaf clover, but the H's didn't necessarily stand for head, heart, and hands. It could have been an incorporation of hustle or home or another H, but the purpose of them was the same, and that was to grant symbolism and importance to the pillars of education that they wanted to teach their kids and their students. But the 3-leaf clover, the design of it is credited to O.H. Benson in 1907. And in 1924, this was another key point in 4-H history when Congress officially granted the name the 4-H Clubs of America. And so that's a long time, 40 years, that these clubs were operating, whether it was somewhat formally or informally, with a certain number of H's prescribed to them. But it took 40 years for, and several pieces of federal legislation to pass for the 4-H club to actually come into being with the name that it has today. But it was very soon after that we began to see an increased level of centralization, organization, and collaboration between states and different groups. So the pledge was adopted shortly thereafter in 1927 at the first ever National Club Camp, which is now the National 4-H Conference. And that was created by Otis Hall. And it's been changed only once since then in 1973 to include My World at the end. For my club, my community, and my country was the original version. And then in 1973, they amended it to include And My World. Again, yeah, it's the waters are so muddy, but it was around 1908 that we saw a 4-leaf clover began to be used, although it was in 1911 that O.H. Benson officially suggested a 4-leaf design. And this is another one of the snippets of information I got when I did this when I was 16. And I want to fact check that one especially because, like I said, it is really tough to find anything definitive about those early years, especially prior to the 20s in 4-H. But we certainly can believe that there were people using both a 4-leaf clover and a 3-leaf clover design between 1908 and 1911. And so progress continues for the 4-H program. So I found this fascinating, that although the 4-H Clubs of America didn't become formalized until 1924, the term 4-H in reference to 4-H clubs was used for the first time in a federal document in 1918. So that certainly tells us that the 4-H clubs were established and using that name well known enough to be cited in a federal document, even if they hadn't been given the formal name of 4-H clubs. And so that goes back, again, thanks to those educators who wanted to expand upon the learning for their students outside of the classroom. And then shortly thereafter came World War I, and the war actually caused enrollment to skyrocket. So both World War I and World War II, of course, saw a great boom in patriotism and desire for folks to support the war effort. And so, in fact, you actually saw people join 4-H clubs specifically to have an organized way to support the war effort. So these clubs were doing what they could to grow livestock for their own communities, to provide meat, dairy, and other products that there were shortages of due to the war. And specifically during World War II, victory gardens were very common among both urban and rural 4-H members alike. And for anybody that doesn't know, victory gardens were simply, it was a garden, but the idea behind them was getting people who wouldn't normally have their own gardens to grow them so that folks would use less of the fresh fruits and vegetables that were in the market, and again, that there were shortages of due to the war. And then you can go ahead and read these numbers, but I just found it incredibly fascinating that in 1942, 4-Hers were able to grow and raise this level of livestock and crops to offset those shortages. It's just really a testament to the program back then and today. But this image right here is probably one of the cooler ones. This is the National 4-H Club Camp, which again, nowadays is the National 4-H Conference. But they actually used to set up tents and sleep in the middle of the 4-H mall. If you look closely where my mouse is right there, you can actually see the Washington Monument in the fog. But it's a far cry from the National 4-H Conference Center that exists today. And then the international bonds began. So after World War II, 4-H international exchanges were a great success, thanks in part to the relative peace that was negotiated following the war. And so in 1948, the International Farm Youth Exchange was created. And between the years 1953 and 1962, there were actually 38 countries that took part in 4-H, along with its exchange programs. So we had other countries that were beginning to adopt 4-H programs as well. So we were exporting not only American goods during that time period when we had an economic boom, but also the ideas that we had, and in this case, youth programs. And then in 1959, the National 4-H Center opened in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower participated in the dedication ceremonies. I'm actually probably going to swap this image out in the future. I did end up finding a picture of President Eisenhower doing the actual ribbon cutting at the conference center in Chevy Chase. And then for folks that don't know, 4-H we're moving forward and things are changing, but the National 4-H Council did recently sell the National 4-H Center that was opened in Chevy Chase. So we no longer have that attached to our name. However, the National 4-H Conference and conferences that were offered there will continue to exist. And then, gosh, who was it that I was going to come back to it? But this is what I dubbed the revolution. So in 1985, an alumni study was done, which helped make 4-H what it is today. And when this alumni study was conducted, they were asking folks what was most valuable from their time in 4-H. And Brenda, I think, was it you that it might have been that mentioned this about changing from not being just an agricultural program, but something more. The alumni study found that there was a great desire to continue some of the softer skills that were built for youth and 4-H. So not just the farming and agricultural practices, but the leadership skills and the public speaking. And so that led largely to the program that we have today. But in the 80s, they also conducted a national needs assessment, and that resulted with 10 new national goals and a new mission statement, which read, "The mission of 4-H is to assist youth in acquiring knowledge, developing life skills, and forming attitudes which will enable them to become self-directing, productive, and contributing members of society." So again, this was when 4-H really did step back, evaluate itself in an academic fashion that we might be familiar with today, and realize that yes, the agriculture and the mechanics teaching were good, but we can expand upon that and offer even more. And so in closing, we have yesterday, 4-H began with values that included hands-on learning and citizenship development. And these values are still held today, although with much greater expectation. And the beginning of 4-H was really due in large part to the Industrial Revolution and embracing the latest sciences and technologies. And we're doing that as quickly as we can today. And from the simple corn growing and vegetable canning projects of the early 1900s, we now have hundreds of projects to choose from in the early 2000s, as all of us will know, from robotics to surfing projects. So we've grown quite tremendously. And here you have a picture of 3 girls, actually, which is why I selected it, because it was interesting for the time that it was female 4-H members with their, I can't tell if those are market steers or dairy. I would assume dairy based on the hip bones there of the cow in the front, but another neat photo. There are some pretty fantastic images that you can find of 4-H in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And today we have a photo featuring yours truly. But in the past 20 years, 4-H has focused very hard on incorporating STEM into its programming. And we are also attempting to serve or attempting to deliver our programs to underserved populations and those who have not traditionally had access to 4-H programming. So that includes making sure that we are reducing racial disparity in the delivering of our programs, seeking to deliver programming to Indigenous and Native populations who ironically we have to thank for our land-grant universities today. And then along with hands-on education, the modern 4-H program provides youth with leadership and citizenship opportunities. That's something, of course, that we're familiar with, but that the origins of that actually go back to the studies that were conducted in the 80s that led to a not solely agricultural based program. And so finally, in closing, with everything that's changed in the past 119 years, both in the program and the world, 4-H's original purpose has not changed, which is to better the lives of young people and their communities through practical education. And I have to pause and say that 119 years, I pulled that from 1902, which is when 4-H has decided to claim was the beginning of our program. But as I hope that you learned through this presentation, is really subjective, and we could state almost any year between like 1985 and or 1885 and 1924, when Congress officially named the 4-H Clubs of America as being a year that we were founded, because there were 4-H clubs operating throughout the country. So that concludes the presentation. What questions do folks have?
I have a question. I don't think that this was covered in the presentation at all, but you know, as 4-H begins to make a greater effort to reach Black and Latinx youth, I'm wondering to what extent 4-H will be able to address the history of white participants in programs such as this one, not just 4-H, but you know, Future Farmers of America and things like that. Where white participants of the program have committed acts of violence against people of color, and what 4-H might do to address racial bias and racial just oppressive behaviors of people who hold dominant identities in 4-H, and how might 4-H go about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, Stephanie. Part of it, I would have to say, is just above my pay grade not to pass the buck. But I know that what 4-H is currently doing, we are seeking in California specifically to make sure that our program is being delivered in a way that is proportional to the racial demographics in all of our counties. And that's a goal that we're constantly achieving and reviewing each year. And then a book that I haven't been able to get a physical copy of, and I can't remember the name of, but it would speak to some of that. It's about gender norms and sexuality within the history of 4-H. And it's actually one of the few books that actually describe the history of 4-H. And I think it's incredibly lucky that we have an academic who went out and wrote a book, not just on the history of 4-H, but speaking to gender norms and, you know, from a feminist perspective, the history of 4-H and the goods and bads therein.
Well, I have to say too, at the state level, we have a diversity or multicultural advisory committee that just formed, that is made up of youth and adults, that is going to be focusing on it, to engage them in how to incorporate discussions and activities in 4-H on a regular basis. So the advisory committee comes up with ideas and solutions. And our staff was one of the first to go through the IDI training. So, and it got funded through, and it went through a lot of the county staff as well as state level staff. And it helped to develop a training for volunteers that is required on diversity training. So part of it is cultural. As you said, there's a lot of white families in it. And part of it is having people understanding their part in it. You know, with the IDI training, you really understand where your communication style and the way you're thinking. With youth development, where we're going with the Thrive model, is also still continuing in that mode of empowering youth to have a stronger voice and giving them a better chance to speak up for themselves. Catherine So has been a leader at the state and national level on developing policies regarding inclusion and language even to use, to not have to switch from gender roles and how to make it more inclusive. So it's actually being addressed from different angles. And we even had a state ambassador who led a great workshop at one of our state leadership conferences just for the kids to discuss what are their issues with gender identity. And it was like packed. They had to turn people away. There was so much interest and the kids just wanted to discuss it because there is no outlet. We're training adults and volunteers, but there is no training for the youth in that way. So, and it's a very sensitive topic because we have a lot of extremely conservative parents and families who are very sensitive to it. So how we approach it has to be very academically supported, I guess. So it's a slow process, but I think by involving youth as well as the adults, it's helping to open more conversations. But thank you. And thank you for attending this.
Yes, Stephanie, thank you for that question. I think it will be important that we all remember, I think part of, Ryan, thank you for doing the history of 4-H. I think it's important to learn the history so we know where historically we've been and where we haven't been. And I think it's an important question to recognize, what are we doing to be intentional about changing who we serve to be more reflective of the demographics of our communities. So Stephanie, I think that's a great question. I think for all of us here, it's going to be very important that we are intentional with changing our program in a way that is culturally relevant and works for marginalized communities, because you've shared the history with us, and marginalized communities have largely been left out of the 4-H program. And so how do we change that? And that's going to be by providing culturally relevant programming and taking a hard look at our history and finding ways that we can change to better serve our communities.
Yeah,
and hiring more staff like Liliana. It's been fabulous. She brings a great perspective on what it's like, from a Latino growing up in California and not feeling included. So she has been fabulous. I'm so excited that she's here. So I think we're heading in the right direction. It's just moving really, really slow.
Yeah, and this actually is, I wasn't able to build it into one of the slides yet, but I want it to be there when I deliver this to the Western Fairs Association. 4-H actually did have a pretty active Black 4-H club population ironically prior to the Civil Rights Movement. So there were segregated clubs, and there were a lot of, because of the history of Black farmers in the South, there were actually quite a few Black 4-H clubs. And that did continue through the Civil Rights Movement. And ironically, unfortunately, and speaking to the truth of 4-H history, after Brown v. Board of Education and integration came to happen, we found that those clubs actually just died off. Rather than integrate, they felt that they weren't welcome in the traditionally white clubs. And so those clubs ended up dying off. And so I just haven't been able to get enough sources and find the right way to build it into the presentation yet. But I mean, those topics and, the Morrill Act, I mean, the land grants being on Native lands, all of those facts are ones that I want to make sure are intentionally built into this history and are not left out.
And I think, we're bringing, from California's perspective, we brought a lot of attention to it with our push for things to be translated in Spanish, to have more diverse images. Because when I started, there were only pictures of white kids. Lupita and I looked at each other, how we're gonna let Latino kids know they're welcome when we have no pictures of them. So, I mean, 4-H is making a definite, from the national level, they're making a definite effort to be more inclusive of different faces as well as different activities. So I'm appreciative of that. And we keep asking, is everything in Spanish? We keep continually asking. And I think that's what we have to do at the state level too. Just making sure, hey, is this available in Spanish? Can we get this in Spanish? Can I get that in Spanish? Or do you have any other diverse pictures? And starting to get people to share their pictures, because all the pictures you see in the national photos are all 4-Hers. So this is not like they're just getting random people. They're actually in 4-H, both the volunteers and the youth that are pictured in national pictures. So it's kind of exciting to see how much it's changed.
Any other questions though? I could talk for a long time, so I'd be happy to answer more.
Well, and if you guys are interested, there is a national 4-H history newsletter that you can subscribe to at that link I gave
Really?
to, and it has some interesting articles that come out. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. This one of them was about camp, or about how camp started, and it's just kind of little trivia that you could throw out there with your clubs, or have little, create some fun games with it. So because it's not, it's like, oh, that's kind of neat that they used to start camp. The national conference started out as a camp on the National Mall. Who can even picture that, right? So little fun things.
Where did you say we could find that?
I shared the link for it's a National 4-H History Preservation Program.
Oh, perfect. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Suzanne. Oh yeah, and Stephanie with the PH from Stephanie, well, no, both of you guys got PHs. But the book that I was talking about, Stephanie Barrett found, and it was the 4-H Harvest, Sexuality in the State in Rural America, and is really good. I got it on Audible and was listening to it while I was starting to do this revision. Any other questions? I can't have covered it all. Please, somebody just ask me a question so I feel good.
So if I'm editing the 4-H history page on our website, you guys recommend I put more focus on California than just national? I know like the whole top half is national. But
if you can find it, definitely.
I like the California, and I also like, a call to counties to submit whatever samples they might have. I think we're all kind of sitting on treasures in our office that might be up on the wall or in a drawer, or something really cool, historical. And then we kind of forget about it, and we don't see it until someone turns on their camera during a Zoom and you see something in the background. You go, oh, that's really cool. How long have you had that? Or where did that come from? Or like I have pieces of a scrapbook from the 1930s or things like that. So I'd love to see a call for, program reps or their volunteers turning over more photographs or photos of items they might have in their office. And I would hope that on the state website, that would be a kind of a welcome to them to send that information in. It helps to piece things together.
I'm not sure what we would do. There is a UCCE like history project. But I'm open to more suggestions how we can do that, because I don't want them to send stuff to us. We don't have a place to store things, and not probably well.
Oh no, just photos.
Photos, okay.
It can be
And
put
I
on
don't know
the
if you guys read that story about Rosie Barker, who turned 100, but she's our oldest living Merced alumni. And she talks about, she has such strong memories of being in 4-H and sewing and she was a hoot to listen to. I loved her. So if you haven't checked it out, it's on the blog and the little video of her talking about it. It's like there's your way, their way, or the 4-H way. Your way, their way, forget it. Always do it the 4-H way. I love that.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for sitting in with me and breaking off the rust, for giving this presentation for the first time in like 14 years, along with some of the updated information. If you have any burning questions, though, feel free to reach out to me, or you can wade into the weeds of the internet. There is a lot of information out there now. And the Smithsonian actually has a couple of really great articles on the history of 4-H. But with that, I will let everybody get back to their Wednesday afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.